there are some children who grow up in loud homes yet feel unheard. Homes where food was on the table, clothes were clean, routines were followed, but emotions were never asked about. These children learned very early how to read a room. They learned when to stay quiet, when to smile, when to disappear. They became watchers, feelers, absorbers. They were the kids who noticed tension before words were spoken, who sensed sadness in a parent's silence, who felt responsible for keeping peace, even when they were too young to understand why peace was needed at all. And those children grew up. As adults, they don't just think, they feel deeply before they think. They walk into spaces already scanning for emotional safety. They listen more than they speak, not because they lack confidence, but because they learned that listening was survival. Empaths who felt emotionally alone, as kids often believe love must be earned through understanding others. They show up for everyone, sometimes forgetting to show up for themselves. They give empathy freely because they remember what it felt like to need it and not receive it. As adults, they struggle with a quiet question that follows them everywhere. Am I too much woe or not enough? They overthink conversations. They replay moments. They worry about hurting others even when no harm was done, because once upon a time, their feelings were minimized, ignored, or misunderstood, and they promised themselves they would never make someone else feel that way. But here is the truth they are still learning. Their sensitivity is not a weakness. It is a superpower that was developed in isolation. What once was a coping mechanism becomes wisdom. What once was loneliness becomes compassion. What once was silence becomes a voice that can heal. These adults think differently because they were shaped differently. They don't chase connection blindly. They crave depth. They don't want attention. They want understanding. They don't fear being alone. They fear being unseen. And the moment they realize that their emotional awareness is a gift, not a burden, everything changes. They stop shrinking. They stop apologizing for feeling. They stop carrying what was never theirs to hold. They learn that they don't need to earn love. They deserve it. Emotional loneliness in childhood does not always come from abuse or neglect. Sometimes it comes from being consistently misunderstood, unheard, or emotionally unsupported, even in a home that looks functional from the outside. Children who grow up in such environments learn very early that their inner world is something they must manage alone. They stop expecting comfort. They stop sharing confusion, and they stop asking for reassurance. Not because they do not need it, but because experience has taught them that their emotional needs will not be met in the way they hope. This quiet emotional absence sharpens awareness. These children begin to notice everything: tone changes, facial expressions, silence between words, emotional shifts in the room. They become highly attuned to what others feel because they had to be. Understanding others becomes a way to stay safe, to avoid conflict, to predict moods, and to protect themselves from disappointment. This is not a conscious decision. It is a survival response developed over time. As adults, this early conditioning turns into deep emotional intelligence. They can walk into a room and instantly sense tension, sadness, excitement, or discomfort. They know when someone is pretending to be okay, when a smile is forced, when words do not match feelings. Their minds process emotional data constantly, often faster than logic or reason. This is why they are often described as intuitive, empathetic, or emotionally mature beyond their years. However, this awareness comes with complexity because they learn to focus outward instead of inward. They often struggle to identify their own needs. They can understand everyone else clearly, yet feel confused about themselves. Their thoughts are shaped by questions like, what hey, does this person need? How will my words affect them? Is everyone comfortable? While their own emotions quietly wait in the background. Emotional loneliness also teaches them self-reliance at a very young age. They learn not to depend on emotional validation, not to expect someone to rescue them, not to assume support will arrive when things feel heavy. As adults, this can look like strength, independence, and resilience, but inside, it often feels like carrying too much alone. They may struggle to ask for help, not because they do not want it, but because vulnerability was never met with safety in the past. This deep awareness also shapes how they form relationships. They seek meaning, depth, and emotional honesty. Surface level conversations feel empty to them because their inner world has always been deep. They are not interested in noise. They are interested in truth. Yet they may hesitate to fully open up, fearing that once again their feelings will be minimized or misunderstood. Over time, many of these adults begin to realize something powerful, the awareness that once helped them survive can now help them heal. Emotional to understand others, it can be turned inward. When they learn to listen to their own emotions with the same compassion they offer everyone else, balance begins to form. Emotional loneliness may have shaped their mind, but it does not have to define their future. The same sensitivity that once felt like a burden becomes clarity. The same awareness that once came from lack becomes wisdom. And when they finally recognize that their emotional depth is not something to hide, but something to honor, they begin to live not just as survivors, but as whole, grounded, and self-aware adults. For emotionally sensitive children who felt alone growing up, listening was never just a personality trait, it was a necessity. In environments where emotions were dismissed, rushed, or misunderstood, speaking up often felt unsafe or pointless. So instead of expressing, they adapted. They learned to listen closely, not only to words, but to pauses, sighs, tone changes, and emotional undercurrents that most people overlook. Listening became their way of staying connected without risking rejection. As children, they quickly understood that attention could be unpredictable. When they spoke about their feelings, they might have been told they were overreacting, too sensitive, or dramatic. Over time, this taught them a quiet lesson. Being quiet keeps you safe. So they observed, they absorbed, they waited. This was not silence born of weakness. It was silence born of intelligence and emotional awareness. This survival-based listening sharpened their ability to understand others deeply. They became the child who noticed when a parent had a bad day, when a sibling needed space, when tension filled the room, before voices were raised. They adjusted their behavior accordingly, becoming smaller, calmer, or more accommodating to maintain emotional balance. This early role of emotional stabilizer followed them into adulthood. As adults, they are often described as excellent listeners, trusted confidence, and emotionally safe people. Others feel understood around them because they truly pay attention. They do not interrupt. They do not rush to fix. They do not judge. They listen with presence. Their mind processes not just what is said, but what is left unsaid. This makes them powerful in relationships, leadership, counseling, and creative work. However, this skill carries a hidden cost because listening became their primary role. Speaking can feel uncomfortable. They may hesitate to express their own needs, fearing they will burden others or disrupt harmony. Their thoughts often include, "It's okay, I can handle it," or others have it worse. They minimize their own pain because they learned early that making space for others was more important than taking space for themselves. This pattern can lead to emotional exhaustion, constantly listening, supporting, and holding space without being held in return creates imbalance. They may feel invisible even in relationships, wondering why they are always there for others, but rarely deeply seen themselves. This is not because they are unworthy of care, but because they never learned how to ask for it safely. Listening as a survival skill also shapes how they deal with conflict. They often avoid confrontation not because they lack courage, but because conflict once felt overwhelming or destabilizing. Silence feels familiar, calm feels protective, but avoidance can turn into self-suppression where unspoken feelings build quietly beneath the surface. Healing begins when they realize that listening does not have to mean a self-erasure. The skill that once kept them safe can now be balanced with self-expression. They can learn that their voice matters just as much as their ability to hear others. Speaking up does not make them difficult. It makes them whole. When emotionally sensitive adults begin to trust that their feelings are valid and welcome, listening transforms from a defense into a gift. They become not only people who understand others deeply, but people who understand themselves. And in that balance, they finally experience connection that is mutual, nourishing, and emotionally safe. Empaths who felt emotionally alone as children often grow into adults who give far more than they receive, not because they're trying to impress anyone, but because giving became their emotional language. When their own needs were overlooked, minimized, or unmet, they learned a powerful internal rule: if I take care of others, maybe the world will feel safer. This belief quietly shaped how they think, love, and show up in adulthood. As children, they rarely felt emotionally prioritized. Their feelings may have been acknowledged only when convenient or not at all. They learned that expressing need did not lead to comfort. So instead, they learned to anticipate the needs of others. They became emotionally self-sufficient far too early, carrying an invisible responsibility to be easy, understanding, and low maintenance. This early conditioning taught them that love flows toward usefulness, not vulnerability. In adulthood, this pattern turns into overgiving. They become the ones who check in first, who remember details, who offer support without being asked. They give time, energy, empathy, and patience freely. Their mind is constantly tuned to questions like, how can I help? What do they need? How can I make this easier for them? While rarely asking those same questions for themselves. Overgiving is often mistaken for generosity alone, but underneath it lives unhealed scarcity. Because emotional care once felt rare, they treat it as something to provide endlessly, hoping that giving will secure connection. They may feel valuable only when they are useful. Rest can feel uncomfortable. Receiving can feel unfamiliar. Saying no can trigger guilt or fear of abandonment. This way of thinking affects their relationships deeply. They often attract people who are emotionally needy, unavailable, or inconsistent because they are skilled at filling gaps. They step into roles of healer, supporter, or rescuer, even when it costs them peace. Over time, they may feel drained, resentful, or unappreciated, yet struggle to change the pattern because it feels tied to their identity. Their inner dialogue often includes thoughts like, I should be stronger, I don't want to be a burden, I can handle this alone. These thoughts are not self-confidence. They are survival beliefs formed in childhood. The truth is, they were not born believing they needed less. They were taught that their needs mattered less. Overgiving also blurs boundaries because they learn to ignore their own emotional limits early on. They may struggle to recognize when something is too much. They push past exhaustion, dismiss discomfort, and override intuition. Their empathy becomes a tool that others lean on heavily, while their own emotional reserves quietly run dry. Healing begins when they understand that giving does not create a worth, it expresses it. They do not need to earn love by sacrificing themselves. Emotional nourishment is not something they must manufacture for others to deserve receiving it in return. When they begin to allow themselves to receive care, to rest without guilt, to ask for support without shame, their thinking shifts. Giving becomes a choice, not a compulsion. Empathy becomes balanced, not draining. And the child who once learned to survive by giving too much finally learns that they too are worthy of being deeply cared for. For empaths who felt emotionally alone as children, sensitivity was often misunderstood. From a young age, they may have been labeled as too emotional, too soft, or too sensitive. Not because something was wrong with them, but because the environment around them did not know how to hold emotional depth. Over time, this messaging shaped how they thought about themselves. They learned to associate sensitivity with weakness, something to hide, control, or apologize for. As children, their emotions were intense because they were unfiltered and honest. They felt deeply because they had to process largely on their own. Without consistent emotional guidance, their nervous systems became highly alert. They noticed shifts in energy, mood, and tone because their safety often depended on it. This sensitivity was not a flaw, it was an adaptation to emotional uncertainty. In adulthood, this heightened sensitivity becomes a powerful internal radar. They feel things before they can explain them. They sense misalignment, dishonesty, or emotional distance quickly. Their mind connects emotional dots rapidly, allowing them to respond with insight and intuition. Yet because of early conditioning, they often doubt themselves. When they feel overwhelmed, they question their strength instead of recognizing their capacity. The world often celebrates toughness, detachment, and emotional control while quietly dismissing sensitivity. Empaths raised in emotionally distant environments internalize this cultural message deeply. They believe strength means enduring silently, not reacting, and pushing through discomfort alone. As a result, they may suppress their emotional responses, convincing themselves that feeling deeply makes life harder. But sensitivity is not fragility. Fragility breaks under pressure. Sensitivity transforms under pressure. It allows for empathy, creativity, awareness, and deep human connection. The ability to feel deeply is what allows these individuals to understand complexity, nuance, and emotional truth. Their mind does not operate on surface level thinking. It processes experiences at depth. This misunderstanding of sensitivity often affects their self-trust. When they feel overwhelmed by noise, conflict, or emotional chaos, they may criticize themselves for needing space or rest. They ignore their nervous system's signals, pushing beyond limits to appear strong. Over time, this leads to burnout, emotional fatigue, and a quiet sense of disconnection from self. Healing begins when they redefine strength. Strength is not emotional numbness. Strength is emotional honesty with boundaries. When they begin to respect their sensitivity instead of fighting it, their thinking shifts from self-judgment to self-understanding. They learn that needing quiet, clarity, or emotional safety is not a flaw, it is wisdom. Sensitivity also shapes their purpose. Many empaths are drawn to roles where emotional insight matters: healing, teaching, creating, guiding, or leading with compassion. Their life experiences have trained them to understand pain without becoming consumed by it. This is resilience, not weakness. When emotionally sensitive adults finally accept that their depth is an asset, they stop trying to harden themselves. They stop apologizing for feeling. They stop comparing their emotional needs to others. They begin to live in alignment with who they truly are. Sensitivity does not make life heavier. Resisting it does. And when they honor this truth, they discover that once felt like a burden was actually the source of their greatest strength. For empaths who felt emotionally alone as children, self-compassion is often the most difficult skill to learn, not because they are incapable of kindness, but because kindness was always directed outward, never inward. As children, they learn to survive by understanding others, adjusting themselves, and minimizing their own emotional needs. This survival pattern quietly shaped how they think as adults, teaching them to be patient with everyone except themselves. Their inner voice is often critical, demanding, and unforgiving. When they make mistakes, they do not simply acknowledge them, they relive them. When they feel tired, they push harder. When they feel hurt, they tell themselves to be stronger. This is not self-discipline, it is self-abandonment learned in childhood when no one consistently modeled how to respond gently to emotional pain. Self-compassion feels unfamiliar because it was rarely experienced. Comfort, reassurance, and emotional validation may have been inconsistent or absent. As a result, their mind associates softness with danger and self criticism with control. Being hard on themselves feels productive. Rest feels lazy. Emotional needs feel inconvenient. These beliefs were formed to help them survive, but they no longer serve them. As adults, this lack of self-compassion often shows up as burnout, anxiety, and emotional exhaustion. They give endlessly to others while ignoring their own limits. They rationalize their pain, telling themselves it is not serious enough to deserve attention. They measure their worth by productivity, usefulness, and emotional strength rather than by inherent value. Healing begins when they recognize that self-compassion is not self-pity, it is not weakness, indulgence, or avoidance of responsibility. Self-compassion is the ability to respond to one's own pain with the same understanding offered to others. It is learning to say, this hurts and that matters without judgment or dismissal. Developing self-compassion requires repairing the self. It means becoming the emotional presence they once needed. This involves slowing down, listening inward, and honoring emotions instead of overriding them. It means allowing rest with guilt, setting boundaries without apology, and acknowledging pain without minimizing it. As this shift happens, their thinking changes. They stop seeing emotions as problems to solve and start seeing them as signals to understand. They begin to trust themselves. Their inner dialogue softens. They replace harsh expectations with realistic ones. They allow imperfection without shame. Self-compassion also transforms relationships. When they stop abandoning themselves, they stop attracting dynamics that require self-sacrifice. They choose connections where care flows both ways. They learn that being loved does not require suffering or proving worth through endurance. Most importantly, self-compassion brings integration. The child who learned to survive through awareness, silence, giving, and sensitivity finally receives what was missing, safety within. This is not a dramatic transformation. It is a quiet, consistent choice to treat oneself with dignity. Healing does not erase the past, but it changes the relationship to it. And for emotionally sensitive adults, self-compassion is not just a healing tool, it is the foundation for a life that feels whole, grounded, and deeply authentic. Empaths who felt emotionally alone as children did not become the way they are by accident. Their way of thinking was shaped in silence, in observation, in emotional responsibility taken on far too early. What once helped them survive became the foundation of who they are as adults, deeply aware, deeply feeling, deeply human. They learned to listen before speaking, to give before receiving, to sense before trusting, and to carry emotions that were never meant to be theirs alone. Their minds learned to scan for safety, their hearts learned to hold space, and their souls learned endurance. These traits were not weaknesses, they were adaptations born from emotional absence. But survival is not the same as living. The turning point comes when they realize that the tools they developed in childhood do not have to control their future. Awareness can include self-awareness. Listening can include their own voice. Giving can exist alongside boundaries. Sensitivity can be honored rather than suppressed. And strength can coexist with softness. Healing does not ask them to become someone new. It asks them to return to themselves, to offer the compassion they give so freely to others in word, to stop earning love through effort and start allowing love through presence, to understand that their emotions are not inconveniences, they are information. When empaths embrace this shift, their thinking changes. They stop shrinking. They stop apologizing for feeling. They stop carrying what is not theirs. They begin to live with clarity instead of cupping, with intention instead of survival. The emotionally alone child does not disappear, but they are no longer alone. They are held by an adult self who listens, protects, and understands. And from that place, empathy becomes balanced, connection becomes safe, and life finally feels like something to experience, not endure.